Well, hello and welcome to the Mindset Mentor. I'm Tania Kolar, helping you cultivate a life you love. Well, I am super excited about today's show because one of my favorite things to talk about is our limiting beliefs, our perception, and I have a human behavioral expert on the show who's going to help us to really sort of unpack why we do the things that we do, what's going on in our lives, and to actually help empower us to cultivate that life we love when we can start to understand the mechanics of the mind and the body. So my special guest today is Dr. Greg Schweeuer, and he is a chiropractor, a kinesiologist, and a human behavioral expert. So really fascinating to have that come together in a way that can really help to serve us both physically and mentally to really reach out and grab the life that we deserve. Well, Dr. Greg, it is an absolute pleasure having you here on the Mindset Mentor today, joining me all the way from Sydney, Australia. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate being here. It's awesome.
Well, it's really cool that we can connect like this, and I think it's so interesting the work that you do, the culmination of the different sciences sort of coming together through chiropractic care, kinesiology, and of course human behavioral studies. So I'd love you if you could just share a little bit about your background and what that means, because I think some people listening may not really understand what is the human behavioral science, and also really what is kinesiology. I mean, these are all things that I think people have maybe heard of, touched on, tried perhaps some of those modalities, including chiropractic care, but they don't really fully understand and how they can actually integrate together.
Okay, cool. So chiropractic is kind of where I began my journey as a professional. And mostly the reason why was I wanted to be a medical practitioner. So initially I went into chiro as a way to get into medicine. Um, but the one thing that I really fell in love with chiro, which kind of ties into the kinesiology and human behavioral side, which I'll get into in a moment, is this philosophy of chiropractic. So chiropractic works according to what's called the triangle of health, the triad of health, which covers three aspects of the way the body functions. So it looks at your biochemistry, so all the chemistry inside of your system, so
Mm-hmm.
nutrition or toxins, structure, which is common to traditional chiropractic work, so that's adjusting your bones and joints and very musculoskeletal focused. And then emotions, which is the stress that we feel and how our body responds to stress. So we, as chiropractors, we focus on all three. Not all chiropractors tend to, in their own practices, focus on all three together. Some
Mm-hmm.
will refer out, but the way that I've always worked in my career is I look at all three pieces. So as a consequence of that, that kind of eventually led me down the kinesiology road in my master's degree. I had a problem with a shoulder injury that traditional chiro wasn't fixing and physio wasn't fixing. And the guy that I landed up working with out of university, he used to lecture once a semester at uni on this particular technique called NET, or neuro emotional technique, is what it stands for. And I couldn't go, but I heard about it, and I was like, I need to go see him. I want to see if this can help me. Because it sounded fascinating that the mind and our perceptions and our emotions could affect the way the body functions.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went and saw him and I was blown away. First session completely blew my mind. I was like, what the heck? I had a weak muscle. He did this treatment and all of a sudden the muscle's strong afterwards. I'm like, what just happened? And 6 months later, shoulders resolved. I'd landed up starting to study it in my master's program as a student.
Mm-hmm.
So I started using it in student clinic before I graduated. And then eventually when I started in practice, that's pretty much what I've been using as a chiro for the last almost 17 years of my career. Now, what kinesiology is, there's different types of kinesiology. I think, where are you based, just out of curiosity?
So Canada, Toronto, basically in the Greater Toronto area. So we're in Mississauga. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I lived in Toronto for a year, and every time people asked me what kinesiology was,
Yeah.
they were like, "Oh, I didn't know that's what it was."
Mm-hmm.
Because from what I understand, a lot of people in Canada understand kinesiology as it's like a degree. It's like a study of muscle movement and rehab. And
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
the way that we use kinesiology in Australia and the way we talk about it is more in the application of muscle movement and
Hmm.
using muscle movement as indications or as diagnosis for what's happening under the surface in the body. So the technique, which really comes from an applied kinesiology version of kinesiology, is designed to ultimately help resolve the impact of stress on the physical parts of the body. So when you
Well,
experience stress,
I mean, this is
yes,
great. Everybody wants to know this because I think everyone has some degree of stress in their lives. Sometimes,
correct.
every single day, every moment, sometimes it feels like, right? So it's so needed to figure out, okay, what can we do about stress? So that's why I love having conversations like this where we can really, start to be proactive and do things that
Mhm.
can really help us to eliminate some of those heavy stressors in our lives.
Correct. And for most people, in fact, for all people, every time we feel stressed, and you would probably know this yourself, anytime we feel any type of stress or any type of emotion, we feel it in the body. We don't feel it in the brain. The brain actually has no sensory input. You can do brain surgery on a person while they're awake and they wouldn't feel it. So all our sensation, all our emotional, our feeling is felt in the body. And what kinesiology is designed to do is alleviate the impact of that stress, the chemistry associated with stress, which is usually cortisol and adrenaline, and there's a
Hmm.
few others, obviously, the impact of that on the cells and the physical tissues of the body. And the more we can alleviate that impact of stress on the physical parts of the body, the easier it is for the body to repair. But this also goes beyond the physiology. It goes beyond because we might have other experiences in our lives, whether it's a relationship problem or a financial issue or a business issue, and we can still experience the stress of that, the emotional stress of that, which can still play a toll on the physical body. And the goal really is to help calm down our emotional reactions and our perceptions of what we're dealing with so we can have more clarity around the decisions we make and the choices we make within every area that we're having um, I guess, opposition in or challenge with. That's
Yeah,
really the kinesiology side.
yeah, I love that. It's so interesting because I think that the body is so great in giving us a signal as to, hey, listen, something's not in alignment, and we need to do something, to get us back on track. So,
Correct.
phenomenal. I think everyone at some point has experienced pain, and sometimes it's debilitating. So it really affects the quality of our lives. So whatever we can do to foster, better health and wellness, really helps us in our day to day, and it's challenging when you're experiencing physical pain, obviously emotional pain as well, right? It compounds all that too.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I kind of you want to go back to something that you said in your own experience where, you had this session with a chiropractor, I believe it was, and all of a sudden, everything seemed to be great after. So what happened? What was it? And was it linked to sort of an emotional factor in your life?
Yes. Predominantly, shoulders are very tricky things in the body. They're not the most stable joint in the body. So
Mm,
usually there's a lot of emotion in shoulders, actually.
mm, mm.
A lot of people hold stress in that area of the body more than most places. So a lot of the issues that kept coming up in relation to my shoulder were relating to either stuff that I'd gone through with my parents that I hadn't resolved yet, issues with an ex-girlfriend or multiple ex-girlfriends at that stage. With not that there were that many, but lots of stuff that I just hadn't resolved.
Hmm.
And the reason why it was impacting my shoulder it was just a weak area. So wherever there's weakness in your physiology,
Hmm.
that's often where the breakdown of cortisol and adrenaline and some of those other chemicals tend to go. It's a path of least
Interesting.
resistance for toxins.
Huh.
So some people will have it in their neck, some people will have it in their back, some people have it in their jaw, some people have it in their shoulders, in their elbows. Some are more organic, so some are more like digestion related or lung related or sinuses. So it just depends on the person's weaknesses.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
that's based on genetics. It's based on any injuries or problems that we've had growing up. And so those
Hmm.
are the weak areas. And so wherever there's weakness, that's the path of least resistance for emotional chemistry.
Wow. Okay,
And
that's
so that was
absolutely.
just, I was just holding a lot of it.
Yeah, really kind of fascinating. So, if we were to eliminate every weakness in the body. So when we have our, body real in full top shape, does that mean that we actually are more resilient physically?
100%. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
obviously, genetics play a huge role in how the body functions. So we all have some degree of weakness,
Mm-hmm.
and we have strength to counterbalance that weakness. So we all have a mixture of, we can't have one without the other
Yeah.
because nature doesn't ever allow us to have one side without another side. So we
Yeah.
all have a little bit of that weakness.
Mm-hmm.
And the key is being able to have greater levels of awareness around those weaknesses in our body,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's a genetic influence that's created that, a congenital problems we were born with it, because something happened in utero, or we developed it through our life. The greater level of awareness we have around it, the easier it is to manage it long term. The easier
Mm-hmm.
it is for us to make sure that we can protect that area as best as possible as we're moving through our life, because it's always going to be there, but we can do things to make sure that it doesn't uh, constantly irritate us or plague us or get in the way of our momentum as we're moving forward through life.
Yeah, well, that's certainly a good goal to have, right? So it's interesting
Yes.
because if I think about, my own personal experience and, physical pain, throughout decades, let's say, I've noticed that there's definitely like, one sort of area that's more predominant, but I also experience like a shift, right? So I feel like I've cleared things in my life and then something else will happen. Maybe moves to a different area. I got to work on that as well. But, I kind of find that really interesting. And I would love to get your thoughts on, stored trauma. Do we
Hmm.
hold on to all of that trauma, and once we, release that emotionally, does it automatically sort of unlock those, areas in the body that have really sort of seized up? I think sometimes we shut ourselves off from the world, and that creates a lot of physical, problems in the body as well.
100%. So, yes, trauma is stored in the body as
Mm-hmm.
well as obviously in our subconscious mind where we process all of that. So, you can release trauma. Trauma is not a fixed point in the
Mm-hmm.
system. Usually, when we experience trauma or our perception of trauma, because it's often the way we interpret events more than
Yes.
the actual event being the way it actually is,
Mm-hmm.
um, we can rebalance that perspective. So I'll give you a very simple story that I heard about this, and then I'll explain how that kind of helps with the body as well. I went to a conference in the US a couple of years ago, just before COVID, for this technique actually, because I wanted
Mm-hmm.
to certify in it. So you don't need certification, but I just wanted to do it. And I'd been thinking about it for years. I was like, okay, this is the year. Went there, and the lady who co-developed the technique with her husband, she was lecturing, and she told us of a story of another seminar she was giving to another bunch of chiros and practitioners, and about a demo that she was doing on this guy on stage, and he had this trauma associated with his father, where he believed his father was abusive towards him, and he had this really strained relationship with his dad. And so they did this whole session on the stage, did the clearing. His brother happened to be in the audience, who was also a chiro. And during the lunch break, he went over to the lady who did the demo and he said, I've got to tell you the story about what he told you, the original event. I've got to tell you what actually happened
Oh.
because I was there.
Mm.
And he said, we all went camping and we were all sitting around this fire, roasting marshmallows and just having a good time and singing and doing all that stuff. And my brother, who's younger than me, he was stuffing around and mucking around, and he got too close to the fire and his clothes caught alight. And so
Mm.
what my father did is he went and got a very heavy blanket. He pushed my brother on the floor and started beating the fire out of him. But my brother remembered the beating pot, didn't remember the blanket, didn't remember the
Mm.
fire, didn't remember any of that stuff, and so developed this whole emotional reality in his mind that his dad beat him
Oh,
and
wow.
abused him. And so had a lot of
Mm.
resentment, a lot of anger towards his dad for the majority of his life because he felt his dad was abusive. The time his dad maybe got a bit angry or a bit irritable, he got fearful because he thought his dad was going to hit him.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh,
And
go
yeah,
ahead. Yeah.
go for it.
Well, I was just going to say, like, I mean, I'm listening to the story and I'm literally getting like goosebumps, like the shivers, because and I'm imagining this young kid going through that experience, and now
Totally.
holding on to a belief that is inaccurate. But I think that the brain tries to protect us, and maybe that point of his clothes actually catching fire was just too much for him to process. That could
Correct.
block that out completely. But talk about
Correct.
a different reality.
Totally. The brain will always, I mean, consciously, we can only process about 2 to 4% what's happening per second. So out of all the information that's coming through our senses, it's such a small amount, and then we fill in the gaps. And a lot of
Mm,
the memories that we have and a lot of the beliefs that we have commonly are mostly emotional reality. So it's mostly stuff that isn't really accurate,
mm-hmm.
100% accurate. And so when we have these experiences and we store this trauma in the body, it can over time affect our physiology depending on where we're storing it and depending on the weaknesses we're having in our system. And as we start resolving that, which can sometimes take time depending on the processes that we're using,
Mm-hmm.
as we work through that and we start resolving that, then the body starts getting into action again. It starts resolving itself again. Because commonly in a pattern like that, for example, that person's going to be an avoidant pattern.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to avoid a lot of perceived challenge and seek pleasure instead. So they're going to be a bit more one-sided because they want to be more supported than hurt in some way.
Mm,
Now, commonly, that's going to create a lot of stress in a work environment because they want things to be more positive than negative. So they're going to deal with way more conflict, way more
mm-hmm.
challenge. They're going to stress them out mentally and emotionally. They're going to put a lot more pressure on themselves, especially a man, tending to do that in a work environment, which will usually cause back problems or heart problems or things like that, which is more common to men.
Mm-hmm.
And then you start developing the physiology or the physiological manifestations of whatever it is we're not dealing with, whatever it is we haven't resolved yet. So yes, resolving trauma can ultimately help the body repair itself and heal and get it back into its natural rhythm and natural flow.
Yeah, and well, that's really the goal, right? We want to get back into alignment and start feeling great and empowered in our lives. There's so many things that hold us back in life, and feel that a lot of that is linked to, again, as you talked about, our perception, our limiting beliefs, our thoughts, our patterns, our behaviors. So we're going to continue the conversation. We're going to delve into more of that. Can't wait to continue the conversation. So stay tuned, everyone. We will be back here on Sauga 960. You're listening to The Mindset Mentor. I'm Tania Kolar, and my special guest today is Dr. Greg Schweeuer. Stay tuned. And welcome back to the Mindset Mentor. I'm Tania Kolar. I hope you are having an absolutely phenomenal day and feeling optimal. How's your spirits today? How's your mind? How's your body? Well, I want you to stay tuned for this hour because we're going to really help to bring things back into alignment. Oftentimes, we know in our lives that something's not working, but we don't really know how to make a change or really how to identify what's going on in the body and in the mind. So my special guest today is going to help us out, Dr. Greg Schweeuer. He is a chiropractic expert as well as a human behavioral expert and a kinesiologist. So combining all of that knowledge together, I think, is absolutely fascinating and can really help us to identify a lot of the issues going on inside the body. We've all had it or have them from time to time. So it's really nice to sort of delve a little deeper into that. So Dr. Greg, it's so great to have you on the show and to continue the conversation. Really fascinating how our thoughts, dictate our lives and control our reality and, what's happening. So, I love that story that you shared about the gentleman who, was completely perceiving a reality differently than what actually happened factually. I think we all do that because it's just, I think, could be just a protective mechanism, or maybe denial even. Sometimes we just don't want to know the truth. So, I'd love for you to delve a little deeper into our perceptions and our limiting beliefs. And, limiting beliefs are one of my favorite things to talk about because I had so many of them. and by the way, they still come back once in a while, right? To challenge me. But I literally, I had so many limiting beliefs. And, I learned learned to reprogram my mind. And, it wasn't an overnight process. And I had no idea that I even had issues or limiting beliefs. And wow, once I started to become aware of them, I thought, wow, where is this coming from? And it doesn't make any sense. And I think that, a lot of people listening can relate to that, where, they have blocks in their lives and they don't know exactly what it is that's holding them back, but they know it's something. So where do we
hmm
start in that case? How can we delve deeper and to find the source and the root of that?
Okay, well, it's commonly known in psychology that a lot of our conditioning starts from birth to roughly around 5 to 7 years old. Those
Mm-hmm.
are our most formative years. There are other people who believe differently to that. I do, where a lot of our beliefs can stem from in the womb as well. So
Mm-hmm.
even as early as conception and onwards, even though we're not cognizant as and aware at conception, we're taking on a lot of the values and beliefs and conditioning of, the genetic blueprint that we come from.
Mm-hmm.
And then as we're developing in the womb, 4 weeks into gestation, our primitive or prematurely developed nervous system is already developing. So that's the brainstem and spinal cord, which is the sensory part of us. And then the limbic brain, which is your subconscious mind, is the next evolution of that. That's kind of almost switching on around that time.
Mm-hmm.
So we're taking in information, processing information, storing information. We have no awareness of any of that at that stage. But we're taking it in and absorbing it and learning via osmosis, via the connection to mom, or via other people who are connected to her, and we have sensory awareness of all of that. So a lot of our conditioning and our learned behaviors and all the limitations that we kind of then subscribe to and develop within that time frame. And once we start school and we start interacting with other tribal belief systems,
Mm-hmm.
other kids come from different tribal beliefs and values and genetics. Then we start, seeing that there's different ways of looking at the world, different ways of living, different ways of experiencing things, of engaging, of connecting. We usually have conflict with that. We sometimes get stressed about it. We sometimes are then comparing ourselves. And then the next evolution will be high school, which is around 12, 13, 14 years old, when we go through another evolutionary cycle where we now are trying to separate from tribal belief systems and trying to find who we are in the mix of
Mm-hmm.
everything. And usually, high school is the most challenging time for a lot of people because we've had all this conditioning in the early stages of our lives, all these beliefs and values that we subscribe to, some not necessarily resonant with who we actually are. Then we interconnect or connect with other people and their ways of being, which then can affect our self-esteem and our confidence and how we look at the world and how we see ourselves in relation to others. And then that changes obviously how we feel about ourselves. And then we get into high school and then we're now trying to figure out who am I? What am I supposed to be doing now? What's the direction I'm supposed to be going in? What do I love? What's my purpose? Where do I fit into the world? Who's my social group? Where's my status in the social hierarchy? Like that all starts to come into play more in high school. Um, and then obviously that continues on as if further iterations post high school. But generally, all of our limitations, conditioning, learned behaviors, beliefs, values, all of that stuff usually is within the first 5 to 7 years of our life. And
Mm-hmm.
if we don't go back and resolve that stuff, then oftentimes it's quite difficult to navigate forward and to move forward because all we're going to have after that are further iterations or variations of what we learned as kids.
Yeah, it's a
So
trigger.
we'll
It's a
have
trigger, right? It's and so
correct,
someone says something and you react in a way, but you're reacting as that 5-year-old or the 6-year-old or the 7-year-old, right? As opposed to what's going on in that
correct,
moment.
correct. And I mean, there will be things as we get older that we'll get triggered to and we'll react to. So, as a perfect example of this, when I've been married once before, excuse me, I've been married once before. It didn't work out, unfortunately, or fortunately, actually. I came back to Australia. I was living in Canada when that was happening. And when I met my wife, my partner, who I'm now married to, probably in the first 2 years of our relationship, there was things that she would say or things that she would do, which would often trigger me and remind me of my ex. And I
Mm-hmm.
didn't necessarily know that in the moment. Um, After the moment, or soon after the moment, I realized, oh, okay, I'm like reacting to that event. However, the issue really that I had around my ex was more an issue that I had with my mom. It was more of an issue that went further back. It
Mm-hmm.
was just the most recent one was coming to the surface because that was the most prominent one that my brain could kind of connect to, which sometimes is what the brain will do. It just gives us context of
Mm-hmm.
what the issue is. But then it gave me more of an opportunity to go and work through some of those issues, some of that unresolved stuff that's still hanging around in relation to my experience that I had with my mom growing up. So most of our stuff is when we're really young.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and I totally agree with you. And, it's so interesting because I think that if we can, just sit with the emotion that comes up, when we're triggered, if we can just sit with the emotion, not have to define it or label it, but just literally sit with it, and be brave to go there, and just allow that emotion to come up. Typically you'll find that you can start to unpeel the layers, right? It's like an onion, you peel off the layers. And if you sit with that emotion longer and deeper, you're going to start to find that it's going to go eventually to the core if you do that over and over. And I know I've done that in my own life where, I've explored it, because you can sometimes understand that a reaction is, not appropriate to a situation, but we have these feelings. So what's behind it? And I think, if we can just look behind the feeling, we're going to start to unravel that core, the core that's trapped in the body, somewhere in the body, right? It's a signal giving us, something, or it's a thought, it's a memory, something that has triggered us. So I think it's important to, to explore, to analyze, to look a little deeper, and to sort of free some of the heavy burden that we carry through our past, through our history. And I know that that's something that, you delve into as well. Helping
Yes,
people, not necessarily identify with their history, not to get locked in that history, right?
correct. So what I normally do, and this is something I learned from one of my mentors,
Mm-hmm.
and I was kind of doing this before, didn't really have a lot of the language to
Mm-hmm.
describe it, but I was doing it anyway. Um, and then when I did some work initially with him, the way that he would describe a lot of the things that I was naturally doing with patients at the time, then all of a sudden I had this language to
Mm-hmm.
communicate things in more of a concise and consistent way. So what I normally would do when I work with someone now is if, let's say, for example, using the example I gave you of myself, if let's say they were triggered by their partner and their partner, in their perception, put them down, if let's say that's what they perceived. So what I would do, which is something I learned from my mentor, is I would go, okay, well, whatever you see in someone else is something inside of you that you just haven't owned yet.
Yeah.
So how about we go and own that? So you can take all the charge off,
Mm-hmm.
and then let's work out how it's actually benefiting you so you can actually counterbalance your perspective on this. So what we would normally do is I'd ask the question, when and where in your life have you put somebody else down or made them feel small? Maybe not in the same way that's been done to you, maybe in a very different form, but to the same degree. And let's look for at least 20 to 50 memories where you've done that, where other people have witnessed you so you can be accountable to the fact and not deny and not lie to yourself and say, I'm not like that,
Mm-hmm.
because that's not true. We're whatever we see in others, we're that too. But oftentimes we don't want to own it because we have judgments on it. We have fears around being that way. We have shame and guilt that we just don't want to overcome. So we just don't want to confront it.
Mm-hmm.
So commonly, then they'll go through that process. They'd go and own it, realize they're no different to the person who's obviously doing whatever it is that they're doing. And then we go through the process of asking, well, how is it currently benefiting you? So they're putting you down. Sure, we can look at the negative because the brain's always going to go there first. But how is it helping you? What is it getting you to do? What actions are you taking in response to it? Are you just keeping quiet? Are you shutting yourself up? Are you isolating yourself? Most people, when they get put down by somebody else, don't necessarily just stay silent, especially when they're adults.
Yeah, exactly.
They'll speak
Mm-hmm.
up, right? They'll stand up for themselves. They'll push
Mm-hmm.
back, which tells me that you're choosing to prioritize yourself. You're choosing to value yourself. You're actually gathering respect within yourself because that person's challenging you to do that. And
Mm.
how would that benefit you in all the different areas of your life? How would that benefit you mentally to stand up for yourself? How would that benefit you in your career, in your financial life, in your family life, in your social life, your physical life, your spiritual life, for you to be doing all of this stuff? And the goal is to uncover at least 20 to 50 benefits, but there could be more. And it's usually until they get that aha moment, that light bulb. where they can see the balance, they can see the benefits that match the downsides, but then they also feel it at the same time in the body. So it's a body-mind connection, which is really the higher mind and the lower mind of the brain integrating. And
Yeah.
it's in that moment that we neutralize the charge. And all of a sudden, we don't fear it any longer. All of a sudden, we don't have judgment on it any longer. All of a sudden, in that moment, we feel a thank you bubble up inside of the body, where we actually want to say to the person, thank you so much for putting me down. It's really helped me grow, or it's helped me be this, or it's helped me take this action.
Yeah.
So my objective really with all the people I work with is to put people in their hearts, not to put people below them or above them. Because as soon as you're doing that, you're actually causing stress inside of your system.
Hmm.
So
Interesting.
I want to help people regulate their perspectives on everything that they're seeing and everything that they're witnessing as much as possible. So they're less emotionally attached to what they experience. It doesn't mean they can't feel emotion. It's just they're not emotionally buying into it.
Oh, yes, that's a beautiful, difference, right? So thank you for clarifying that. Really, really interesting because, we all, I think, can. There's usually one person in particular in our lives that really just pushes our buttons. It's a trigger. And as you
Yeah.
say, we got to own that. What we don't like in them, is part of us. And, I can also, think of people in my life where I'm like, I'm really annoyed by this person. And then when I start to think about it, I'm like, wait a minute. Why am I annoyed? It's me. It's something that's reminding me, this little trigger. So I think that we need to embrace those shadow parts of ourselves, right? The ones that we don't
Hmm.
like, that we try to avoid, that we think, oh no, I don't have that quality. That's only for people like that, right? But it's like, well, hold on a
Yes.
second. If I'm recognizing it, it means I have it too. Yeah.
Totally. Whatever
Mm-hmm.
we see in another person is just a reflection of ourselves.
Yeah.
Like I used to be labeled a load of different things,
Mm-hmm.
and people still call me this. But I don't have emotional attachment to it. And from their perspective, they're 100% accurate through the lens that they're looking through, the beliefs that they have. The label that they're giving me is correct. Like,
Mm-hmm.
yes, I'm selfish from your point of view. I'm arrogant from your point of view. I'm cocky from your point of view. I'm being rude, maybe, from your point of
Mm-hmm.
view. And I can totally see that. It doesn't mean that's the only perspective, though,
Yes.
because then I'll have another bunch of people on the other side who have a completely different belief system and a completely different set of values. And I'll look at the actions that I'm taking and they might go, all he's doing is honoring himself. All he's doing is being confident. All he's doing is being self-assured, as an
Mm-hmm.
example, right? They'll label
Mm-hmm.
it differently.
Yeah.
So both labels are correct. None of them are wrong. It's just different perspectives on one person's action. So at the end of the day, it's the same thing that we're doing to other people. At the end of the day, people are just being people. It's the way we've been taught actually through society, through culture, through religion, through our own family dynamics, why one set of actions is perceivably negative versus another set of actions being perceivably good. But in the reality, the rest of the brain behind the neocortex, the cognitive part of the brain doesn't look at any action as a positive or a negative. An
Mm-hmm.
action is just an action. It's just a thing that's happening. It's the conscious brain way, the way we've been taught, that says this is good and this is bad. Because we need that conscious mind to help us differentiate between things in our environment. It's what helps us live in a world of matter. Otherwise, we wouldn't know how to cope. So we need the neocortex to help us understand our world.
Mm-hmm.
If we only lived in the subconscious mind, it would be very, very challenging.
Oh boy, yeah. Let me tell you, that would be very challenging indeed. It calls to mind a story that I heard of two sisters. Obviously, well, they're sisters. They grew up in the same home, and they were just maybe a year or two apart. And their father would lock them in the bathroom as punishment when they were, not behaving, and put them in the bathroom. And later in life, these girls were recounting their experience. One of the sisters said, it was terrible. He locked us in the bathroom. It was so awful. I was by myself. And, she had this, whole story of how awful it was. And then the other girl, when she was recounting her experience, she said, "Oh, it was actually great. I was loved. I had my own time. I had fun. I had this, play imagination." So it was the same experience perceived completely differently, right? So I thought,
Correct.
wow, what a interesting story. To again, like it really encourage us to look at our reality, and if there's something that really doesn't feel like it's serving us, well, how can we find it and look at it and view it in a different way, to perceive it in a different way, that we can move forward powerfully. Well, we're going to continue the conversation here on Sauga 960 with my special guest today, Dr. Greg Schweeuer, who is a chiropractor. He's a kinesiologist and also a human behavioral expert, helping us to kind of figure out what makes us tick, why we do the things that we do, and sometimes even like why we don't do some of the things that we know we should do. All right, we're going to take a break and be right back here on Sauga 960. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Mindset Mentor. We are helping you cultivate a life that you love. And remember that your mindset is like a muscle that needs to be strengthened and conditioned. So I want you to consider this your mindset workout. We're going to have you working out your life, taking a look at your perceptions and your limiting beliefs, and really look at, how are they serving you or are they not serving you? Things that we can, drop away or let fall away, and things that we can bring in and really highlight to help us get to the life that we love, that feels good, right? We want to feel good, and I think too many people on this planet are not living a life that they love. They go to work, they hate their jobs, or they dislike it very much. Hate is a powerful word, but I think that the little things that we can do in life, and maybe we are in a situation that we can't necessarily change everything, but it's the small things that we can change that can exponentially advance our lives. So we're going to continue the conversation with Dr. Greg Schweeuer. He's a chiropractor, he's a kinesiologist, and a human behavioral expert. And I just love all of these topics, Dr. Schweeuer. I mean, this is fantastic. It's a great conversation. I'm absolutely loving the conversation. So let's just jump right back in. And, you had mentioned at some point, in this interview, that you believe that a lot of our past, is from, ages maybe like, up to 7, but it stems back. So even down, as far back as the womb. So can we go back there a little bit? Because I want to talk about, how that really, influences us. And it's proven scientifically as well. I mean, this is science-backed information that we can, take on and absorb that information from our, mom, in the case of being in the womb. And obviously our surrounding, our limiting beliefs come from that. It really dictates our patterns and our habits and our beliefs, and certainly our perceptions.
Absolutely. I mean, yes, I spoke about a lot of the stuff that happens in the womb. What I didn't speak about, which I sometimes deal with patients and clients
Mm-hmm.
occasionally, it just depends on the person, is we can sometimes go even further back. Now, that might sound a little bit odd because, to some people, I wasn't alive, so how am I going to remember anything?
Mm-hmm.
But remember, you have the genetic blueprint of your family and various generations that have come beforehand. And we can see a lot of evidence in a lot of different cultures and even racial groups who've experienced problems in their past,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's slavery in the US, whether it's apartheid in South Africa, whether it's the Holocaust for Jewish people. I'm Jewish, so I
Mm-hmm.
come from that understanding.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll often find, even though there's generations that have passed between the original event, that usually our grandparents would have gone through, our great grandparents would have gone through. Um, for some reason and somehow we have some connection to it. We have some feeling about it, some association with it. Some people, like for example, being Jewish, there are, and this is no thing on anything to do with the people in Eastern Europe. This is
Mm-hmm.
not my judgment about anything, but it's because of the experiences that people went through during that time and the dissatisfaction that they had with the people in that time. And sometimes later generations can still feel that same dissatisfaction, that same feeling of discomfort inside of their own body, that same emotional trauma is there.
Mm-hmm.
And The question is, how does that happen? Well, it's not some woo-woo thing. It's not like some people might see it from that perspective, from a very spiritual point of view, and that's okay. There's no right or wrong. I don't believe in right or wrong. Everyone's got different points of view and perspectives on this. But I look at things more on the ground level. So I look at things more from a scientific perspective and more from a genetic or epigenetic influence point of view or transgenerational point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes people are carrying trauma from old stuff that is permeating through their existence and through their life, and they're living through it as if it's their reality, but they don't understand why it keeps happening, or they don't understand why they feel that way, or they don't understand why they keep attracting similar situations that happen for their parents or their grandparents. Um, so oftentimes we work with that as well and help calm down and clear out the genetic influences or the epigenetic influences that are having an impact on how people are functioning in their realities today. It doesn't happen all the time. I
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't say it's the most common thing that I deal with, but if it happens, we go explore it. So I don't necessarily look at it like some practitioners would look at it as past life stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I look at it as let's look at it as a generational issue. So we're looking at generation before, previous generation before that, et cetera, and seeing what the genetic influence and epigenetic impact would be, which is a lot more grounded, I feel. And that's
Mm-hmm.
just my approach. And oftentimes, a lot of patients will connect to that more because it makes sense, because they can track that history and they can track that genetic influence, and they can track the behavioral influence. And it's something that I just wanted to add, just in relation to this, is more to do with like physiological issues that people present with from generation to generation.
Yeah.
So, like heart problems or cancers, for example, or back issues or whatever it might be, you'll find in generations prior to the one that you're in, if there are certain beliefs and values that permeate from one generation to the next, they're not resolved, they don't ever get cleared out. The physiological manifestation of that actually moves from one generation to the next. And so then you land up having the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the main goals, and that's more epigenetics more than anything else, the influence of your environment,
Yep.
beliefs, and behaviors influencing gene expression.
Mm-hmm.
And so the goal really would be to help calm down all of those beliefs and those values so you don't actually pass that on to the next generation. So they don't land up actually having the same epigenetic impact that previous generations have had on you.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And absolutely, we can take charge and change it. It doesn't have to continue. It's interesting because, I'm really fascinated by transgenerational epigenetic inheritance. And, I've read some stories on that, which I found, fascinating, exactly to that point where, people were living out somebody else's trauma, from their ancestors, and
100%.
yeah, so I think it's a kind of an interesting point to maybe do a little bit of research in the family history and the family tree, and we may not always figure out the answers, and there may not be anyone around to ask these questions, but if there
Hmm.
are, I would ask the question. Both of my parents have passed, and I wish now that I have this knowledge, I could ask them, some
Yeah, of
questions
course.
and explore further. But it can absolutely stop here if there's a pattern that we don't like, if there's something that's not serving us. We can really work to change that, to set up our environment in a way that's going to empower us. Again, I love the work of Dr. Bruce Lipton that talks about
Yeah.
that environment, right, as you were discussing, right, with the the epigenetics. And so there are certainly a lot of things that we can look to, and it really begins with our mindset. If we look at our lives, everything is equated to mindset. Our reality. It's those perceptions, our beliefs. So we want to condition and strengthen the mindset as much as possible to get us to where we want to be, to move us from an area that we don't want to be in to somewhere else where we can thrive, where we can flourish. Because I think so many people, Dr. Greg, are simply surviving, especially going through, a lot of the stress that collectively we've gone through. It now seems that people's tolerance is much lower and they're triggered
Hmm.
more often in daily situations that would not normally be a trigger. So, what can the listeners do in a case like that to kind of take stock in that moment, to bring themselves back to, like, okay, hold on a second, am I overreacting here?
So the thing that I'll say, this is the thing I say to people all the time. So first identify specifically what the trigger is. So the more you understand what the trigger is, the more you understand what specifically is happening to you,
Mm-hmm.
and you can give it give it like context. Um, Same process that I mentioned before, is I get them to go look for when and where in your life have you done it, own it, take it away from you. So stop being the victim of the experience that you're dealing with.
Oh, yeah.
Take ownership of that so you
Mm-hmm.
can stop being that victim and then find out how it's serving you. So counterbalance your perspective. So I remember when we went through COVID, I had a very specific perspective on the way things were being handled, and I got really reactive to that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I put a label on the authorities collectively doing whatever I
Mm.
perceived that they were doing. And I went, okay, when and where have I done that? And I realized where I'd done that. I was like, oh God, I've done it to the same degree as them. Oh, sh I just didn't realize that I'd done that.
Yeah.
And I was like, there's no way I've done this. I've never done this to human beings before, but I had. And once I realized it, it really humbled me a lot,
Mm-mm.
massively. And it took so much charge of what was going on. And when I started looking at the benefits to me, it was helping me do, helping me accomplish and come up with as ideas. And I was like, I'm so grateful this is actually happening because it's helping me navigate myself and push myself into a direction in my life that I never even would have comprehended it would ever do. And I wouldn't change it. I wouldn't turn around and go, you need to deal with this differently. You need to handle the population differently. You need to handle us differently.
Yeah.
I'm like, thank you for doing that. It really made a huge difference in my life.
Wow.
So the goal
Mm-hmm.
is to always own what you see. So you take take the I guess the power of somebody else having this control of you away. So you're back in ownership, you're back in power and control, and then find out how it's serving you. So ask that question until you get an aha moment. And
Yes.
when you get that aha moment, then you stop because that's when you've neutralized it. And usually you
Oh,
feel thank you in that moment.
oh, I love that. And it's really looking for the opportunity in the moment. I sometimes will, catch myself and I'll say, isn't it interesting, that this is happening? Isn't it interesting that I'm doing this? Because now I'm delving deeper and I'm exploring that, right? So finding what that root is, such great information. I'm loving the conversation. Unfortunately, we are out of time. So I want to say
It's all
thank
good.
you, Dr. Schreeuwer, for being here today and sharing a wealth of knowledge and helping us to, really put into practice some key tools that we can use right away. We can get started and we can also start to cut the cord of the past so that we're no longer carrying some of the stuff that no longer belongs to us that we sort of
Yes,
inherited, right, through our DNA.
100%. Well, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate being on your show. It's been fantastic. It's awesome.
Yeah, that was so great. All right, everyone. Well, you've got the tools to cultivate a life you love because remember, you are extraordinary. You were born into an extraordinary world and you are extraordinary. Let's own that together. Stay tuned. We'll be back here on Sauga 960.